Okay, so those mics are all live at this point? Yeah, so you guys can just kind of grab those mics and use them. So I'll just try to go through as many of these as I can. I'm going to try to mix them around to make sure not one single person is answering all of them. So if you see me moving around, I'm not trying to dodge any card. I'm just trying to mix it up a little bit. Where is the water from Felton Dam diverted to? Graham Hill Treatment Plant or Loch Lomond or both? And will it ever be diverted to Scotts Valley?
The Felton diversion, which is just down the street here, that project was designed to divert water into a pipeline that goes to Loch Lomond. We don't currently, we have occasionally in the past, but we don't currently divert it straight to the Graham Hill Water Treatment Plant. I can't say about the business of sort of sharing water with Scotts Valley. It's obviously one of the things we're talking about. We are currently sharing water with the Soquel Creek Water District. And we're looking at changes in the places of use in our water rights to open those up to enable us to do that. Should agreements and be a necessary thing that's to everybody's benefit.
Okay, why do we still allow fishing for steelhead in the San Lorenzo River? How can we change that? And everybody looks at John. I'm shocked by that.
Where's Mandy Ingham?
She was here.
Oh, come on, Mandy.
Mandy. On the spot.
I'm not putting you on the spot, but if I get this wrong...
I'm pretty sure you are,
actually. If I get this wrong, correct me. Now, fishing for steelhead, they can't take one that's a wild one, right? They can capture it, but they have to release it.
We're having
steelhead.
Go ahead and give her the mic if you could.
Yeah, I
John?
don't think you would have.
No, the mic. There.
In San Lorenzo we're talking about.
Yeah.
Yes.
Do we run into, sorry. Do we run into very many hatchery? I mean, we don't have...
Well, the question was, why do we still allow fishing for steelhead? And I'm over here, Mandy. I'm reading it from here. Over here. Hello.
I don't know why.
That's why I do the same thing. Like, there's a voice coming. Okay, why do we still allow fishing for steelhead in the San Lorenzo River, and how can we change that?
That is a good question, and it's more appropriate to ask California Department of Fish and Wildlife. They actually control the fishing regs.
Yeah, but there is one point that I would like to bring up about the fishing community. Now that I've worked in the Central Valley, where we have very few advocates for our fishery, sometimes these are our strongest advocates for getting things done. And when we work south, the further south we go, people are totally disconnected from their fishery. They don't realize that these animals are in their stream. And having an advocate, even though, hey, look, we know what's going on, but there's still an advocate. Whereas, for the most part, we don't have advocates for these fish.
All right, I'll read this one and see who wishes to take it. Environmental studies are good, but expensive. What we learned in the game is that on limited budgets, agencies have to think water supply first. How do we balance cost of environmental issues with rising costs to supply water and being accountable to ratepayers? John, you want to take that one? I'm just kidding. So, anybody?
I'll respond. I think this is something that we obviously are dealing with big time in the city of Santa Cruz, because we are making a commitment. We have made a commitment to provide in-stream flows, and that has had an impact on what we need to do to create supplemental supply. My view is that our job as water utility managers is not just stewards of the water system and making the water come out. It's being stewards of the natural resources that we depend on, and being responsible stewards taking the long view. So from my perspective, doing what we're doing and dealing with the rate impacts of it is what our community wants us to do. It's matched up with our community's values. And so it's totally aligned, and I don't make excuses for it. I tell it like it is.
This may be maybe a policy question, but it also may be something that John or Georgina would like to field. Is there a conflict in priorities between above ground hydrogeology, such as plant and fish life, and below ground aquifer restoration, like a water table? Is there a conflict in priorities? either from a policy perspective or a technical perspective. John Ricker takes the mic to his mouth.
Well, in terms of a policy perspective, they're all linked. I mean, you can't really separate the two of them. We're really managing for the whole ecosystem, the whole watershed, the whole basin, which is both surface water and groundwater. So I think that's maybe a false dichotomy, that we're really trying to manage for the whole.
Okay.
I agree.
This is going back to a couple of cards, or a card from the groundwater and hydrology session. What was the hypothetical recharge budget prior to any modern development? Do we have any sense of knowing what a sort of a pre-development or pre-settlement kind of budget would have been?
I think it was in the model. I don't remember what exactly it was. There was a calculation that I think we've lost something like 500 to 1,000 acre feet per year of recharge as a result of developing the impervious surface. That would be in the model report where that information is.
Okay. What is the definition of drought vis-a-vis groundwater? So how do we define a drought? I mean, there's a state proclamation that a governor makes of an emergency, but is that how we define it, Brett?
I can try that. So it is very local. Even in the 4-year drought, there were counties in the state that were not subject to the same conditions. Mendocino, for example, and they fought very hard against the 20% flat or 25% flat because it didn't apply to them the same way. Every urban water management, every urban water supplier that supplies more than 3,000 customers has to have an urban water management plan done, and typically it's in there what for them is considered a drought. It's has a lot of science in it and some art, so you're typically kind of looking your specific year. 1 year typically doesn't do a whole lot of damage to any of us. You kind of saw that in your games. It's what happens next year, and then what happens the year after that. That's kind of our biggest variable. But we try to quantify it. We go into if it's a 2-year or 3-year cumulative less than average rainfall, how many percent. That puts us in stage 1, stage 2, stage 4 drought, and it's very local. So looking at, well, how come they have a different percentage than we do? It's because they're relying on different supplies, and that specific year has a different impact for them.
All right, here's one that maybe goes back to John Ambrose. How much do we know about the impacts and pressures salmonids face while in the ocean, such as ocean acidification, sea temp, sea rise, predation, commercial fishing, etc.?
This is getting at that life cycle issue again. And those are impacts in the ocean. What the future will look like offshore is hard for me to be able to say. But in regard to those impacts, predation has always happened. The animals evolved with predation. And we like to point our fingers at one thing and say that's the problem. And there are problems at every stage of their life cycle. Some of those are easier to manage than others. But those are issues that we're facing. But we can't let that make us throw our hands up and say it's too hard. We have to try as hard as we can over what we can control. And so that's the best I can answer that.
I'm going to throw this one to Chris, and he can balk at it if he wants. Anybody can take it, but just because I know that you deal with grants and things like that. Will there be any funding that will take the pressure off paying for the steps needed to, we assure, protecting groundwater-dependent ecosystems? So basically, groundwater-dependent ecosystems are to be protected. There is a nexus, at least in terms of identifying those as some relationship to groundwater. There may need to be protection. Is there going to be funding someplace for that? Is there funding out there now? And perhaps specifically to Sigma, since that's where some of this is coming from.
I can certainly a lot of.
I mean, if you don't have an answer, that's fine. But I figured.
Certainly, a lot of the bonds that have been written in recent years have funding for groundwater sustainability and groundwater management. I think John will add to this, but it sounds like the Santa Margarita Group and I believe Mid-County also have received grants to help develop their GSA or GSP. Sorry, I'm out of the groundwater game a little bit. And as I mentioned in my presentation, the effort on the San Lorenzo River 2025 partnership, as we call it, is really seeking to attract resources to Santa Cruz County for a lot of this work, not only in terms of groundwater management, in terms of habitat restoration. I think there's a generally good perception of the work that we're trying to do here in Sacramento. In Sacramento, they see the work that we're doing here as being beneficial. However, we're off the radar as well, too. They're so focused on the Delta that they just, attracting funding out here is difficult. And that's really one of the things we've been trying to do, is raise the visibility of the need as well as the opportunity here.
I was just going to say, we are getting a grant to do the groundwater sustainability plan. It's $1 million from the state. It's about 50% of the funding to develop the plan and do the studies that we need to answer some of these questions. In the past, we've gotten money to do projects. The recharge projects in Scotts Valley that we talked about were partially funded by grant funds to be able to develop those projects. They're also looking at funding for recycled water projects, and as the bonds roll out, there does seem to be money available to help with the project.
I think just one thing to add is that for those of you who may recall, Prop 68 was on the June ballot and did pass, and that was a very specific for parks and a lot of the water stuff in that particular bond is related to habitat restoration and stream flows and those kinds of issues. So there definitely is, that's definitely on the radar, and I think that it reflects the fact that the people who put these things together recognize that funding these kinds of things simply only from local sources is a challenge. It's going to continue to be a challenge.
To put it in context, just if I may, just because I do so much work in Sigma, there was a number that John just spoke to, which is this basin got $1 million in Prop 1 funding. And did you catch what he said? How much percent of the GSP that's going to pay for? Half. So take that and multiply that by the 127 basins in the state of California that are required to comply with Sigma. That's money that came out of Prop 1. Prop 1 had, if I remember correctly, about $100 million in it for groundwater planning. Prop 1, for those of you that recall it from 2 or 3 cycles ago, if you voted on that, it actually predated Sigma. The money was in there, and they basically repurposed water that was defined as for groundwater planning writ large, and then all of a sudden, oh, we have Sigma, and they repurposed that money in Prop 1 specifically towards Sigma. And Rosemary's right, that Prop 68 was important this past summer, because that's sort of like the next round of potential money to be made available. What plans are there for water desalinization in Santa Cruz County, if any?
I would say the answer to that right now is there aren't any. If you want to see an analysis of what Santa Cruz has looked at with respect to that, you can look at a November 28th, I think, 2018 staff report that you can find on the City Council's website. The ocean plan amendments that occurred in, I think, 2015, requiring subsurface intakes are sort of as a game changer for looking at the cost effectiveness of desal compared to, say, recycled water. And so that has been a really big change. So you can see that there's been some analysis and updating done on desal for the city of Santa Cruz, but it's been sort of pushed to the back burner because it doesn't look very viable.
What is the January 2015 baseline, and what should the baseline be? It didn't specify which indicator, but I'll let somebody fill that.
Well, that's a baseline that's in Sigma for all the indicators. That's when Sigma went into effect. It was January 1st of 2015, and it just said, okay, you can't let things get any worse than they are now. So I think there's still a lot of the agencies are grappling with what does that mean. Do you really look at specifically what was going on January 1st of 2015, or do you look at the average conditions going into that? we're really, I think, we're not spending a lot of time trying to figure out what things were on January 1st of 2015. We're looking at what's right for our basin here, and that's going to be what our objectives are based on.
And it's also, I mean, again, I'll just say relative to Sigma, because John at the outset walked through the sustainability indicators, and you may have noticed that one of them was water quality. And it's important to remember that things like water quality and the difference of opinion that you heard a little bit of here between what John Ambrose said and what Sierra talked about the groundwater surface water flow, is that those groundwater quality in Sigma and surface water groundwater in Sigma are not written to become proxies for new water quality regulation, for instance, okay? And so then starting to decide, well, what did it mean where we were on water quality in 2015 is a very squishy question that lots of agencies in the state are dealing with, and the state agencies don't really have answers yet. In which streams in Santa Cruz County are salmon spawning grounds found? Ready, begin.
Most of them that are open to adults moving in. I'd say most of the streams in Santa Cruz County, unless you have a waterfall or something along those lines, or most of them are accessible anadromous fish-bearing streams. I could, once upon a time when I used to work here, I could name them all and run through north to south, but I can't do that anymore.
Keep the mic. Here's one more question for you. We're not done with you yet. Okay, I'm going to ask this question, but I'm going to give opportunity for John to not answer if he's not comfortable. Okay. Is there danger from the present Trump administration to reduction or elimination of NOAA's mission?
I'll let you answer that question.
I'm a third-party neutral. So what does the audience think? Yes. Oz has spoken. All hail the great and powerful Oz. Why doesn't San Lorenzo Valley Water District comply with the terms of its Fall Creek water permit, which are for the protection of salmonids?
So that's true. We are in violation on the Fall Creek bypass flow at the diversion there. Fall Creek is the primary water source for the town of Felton, and we have a couple of other small springs. And so the problem is that water source is the only source for Felton. And so it's tied to the total flow on the San Lorenzo River. And when the San Lorenzo River drops to a certain level, and that's typically in October and November, at the end of the summer when it's been really dry, then our water right says we cannot divert any water from Felton or from any of the springs for the town of Felton. So we're in violation on that water right, and we are working for the last few years doing a lot of studies and looking at how our diversions are impacting the total flow in the San Lorenzo River, and looking to improve stream flow in the San Lorenzo River main stem. And we're working towards a conjunctive use, which means we'll be looking to move water around to try to alleviate the Felton water right violation. That'll be one of our primary goals of our conjunctive use effort that we'll be talking about more at the next workshop, I imagine. So.
While you've got the mic, and just because you and I were chatting about this on the phone yesterday, about 50% of San Lorenzo Valley Water District's water is surface water diversion, about 50% is wells, is that correct? And wells, your well fields or your well clusters or individuals there, are they set relatively far away from some of these tributaries, or are they relatively close to the tributaries, relative to this groundwater surface water exchange question?
Well, it seems that our system is infinitely complex. So saying any one, trying to capture it in one statement is really oversimplifying it. But so we have we have 3 systems that we operate that are all from separate sources of water and are provided to 3 separate communities that are can be connected through an intertie, but we don't operate it that way because it hasn't had the regulatory environmental review done on the intertie to be able to do that on a regular basis. So it's only for emergencies, that pipeline. So we operate these 3 systems separately, and what Dave is asking about is the north system. Our north system has about 50% of its water comes from surface water, 50% of the water comes from groundwater. And those wells are located in the Olympia watershed near Zayante and in the Quail Hollow wells that are also near Zayante. And they're on either side, both sides of Zayante. Those wells are relatively shallow, and you guys saw a lot of figures earlier about how the aquifer has different layers, and those aquifers that we're pumping from, it's coming from the Santa Margarita, which is the top layer, and that is the most, that water would be the most directly connected hydrologically to Zayante Creek. So they're relatively close, and they do have impact on Zayante Creek. However, I would also add that water gets moved up into the watershed, up into the north system, and that goes miles up past Boulder Creek, and it gets returned through septic system flow. So then there were increasing stream flow in the upper watershed through our operations of pumping water down by Zayante and moving it up into the northern reaches of the watershed. So there's some habitat benefits in the main stem of the San Lorenzo River way up in the top of the watershed.
And by the way, kudos to Jen. As I said earlier, she's not feeling well. She purposely came back and decided to stay for the Q&A session. So let's give her a round of applause. Or a cup of hot tea, perhaps. Okay, I'll just read this one and see who wants to rise to this bait. No pun intended, or maybe it was. Should LAFCO help with consolidation of water agencies to ensure long-term regional cooperation after the Sigma plan is approved? I think water has become too political to the detriment of good regional management.
I think the water agencies are working very well together right now. I don't think we really need LAFCO to come in and try to do that. We do have a memorandum of agreement right now between Scotts Valley Water District, San Lorenzo Valley Water District, City of Santa Cruz, and the county to work together on conjunctive use in the Santa Margarita and the San Lorenzo watershed. So at this stage of the game, I've been around for a while, and I wouldn't say the same thing, say, 20 years ago, but at this stage, I think we're working well together.
I'll also say something that just, and I really sincerely mean this, I mentioned at the last meeting, I oversee or work directly in 35 different basins in the state. My staff are in it, I oversee their work plus the work that I do in specific basins. So it's a lot of basins that we're engaged in at Sigma. You haven't, for whatever it's worth, and I'm just giving you this as my neutral comment, you have an A-team of water agency leadership right here, okay? You have, seriously, you have an absolute A-team compared to a lot of places that I work, seriously, okay? Consultants across the state would give their left lung to be able to work with this group, and by extension, the board. How many board members are still here from the agency, or the various agencies? So, your board's here. Yeah, give it up for them, seriously, okay? Seriously. Is there a recommended minimum water flow in our creeks and rivers to support fish recovery? I didn't write that one, John. I know you and I talked about it.
Not necessarily. Every watershed you have to look at individually. And for example, for the Santa Cruz HCP, we're coming up with minimum flows, targets at different points of diversion. It took years to work up those numbers. It takes a while to figure that out because each watershed is truly unique.
Can I just add one thing about that? I think that John showed the life cycle of the fish, and with the exception of the part of the time when they're in the ocean, the flow goals that we have, that we're putting in our water rights and that we're putting in our HCP are specific to the various life stages, what they need at that stage. They need different kinds of levels of water when they're rearing versus when they're trying to migrate in and migrate out, spawning, when the spawning eggs are incubating. So I think that it's a science-based, data-based sort of process and a negotiated process, and you try to find a way that you can still sort of meet the needs of the fish, maximize the best you can, and still operate a water supply project, which is what I think the flow goals we've developed do.
Chris, were you going to?
And it drives our operators crazy.
Yes. And they have to get over it.
I always wait in the meeting. Eventually, Rosemary's going to do something like that. So. Alrighty. How does the groundwater agency, the new groundwater agency, ensure that the city of Santa Cruz does not violate and/or attempt to increase long-established water rights, so it does not deplete the current surface water, thereby threatening our slowly declining groundwater basin levels? How does the agency basically keep an eye on the city of Santa Cruz?
Well, I mean, I guess what I would say is that with respect to water rights, we are in compliance with our water rights. We're about to amend our water rights to make our compliance with respect to flows more specific. We are in the water rights modifications we're not asking for any more water at all from any of the rights we have, and we're looking at more flexible ways to use that water in a way that could help us meet our goals both for water supply reliability and for fisheries. So, you know, I mean, we're going to be part of this because we obviously have a stake in the basin. I don't know that anybody has to make us do anything because we are here voluntarily to be part of the solution.
So I would like to add to that this is something that we all feel very, very strongly about, all of the water managers at the agencies. This is what we do day in, day out. We're really, really passionate about the field and in the long run. I mean, we are here to stay. This is our authorities to provide water. So none of us are interested in looking long-term solutions that are going to take water away from somebody else or get us to the point that it's not sustainable. So I think that's kind of the collaborative and forward-thinking strategic view of all of us. It's going to be the best guarantee, but there's always courts. I mean, I think that's where you take people who don't follow the rules, and I don't think that any of us here think that that's a good solution outcome for anybody else except lawyers. So
Has the recent PG&E vegetation management effort resulted in any measurable changes in erosion and stream turbidity?
Yeah, Nancy could probably answer that better. You're the eyes in the watershed. We haven't been doing any measurements or haven't really seen impacts, but I hear that there are.
Nancy, do you want to give observational insight?
Not very science-based. This is anecdotal. But virtually any of the roads where there are private roads off of, like, for example, several private roads off of Bear Creek Road. As you drive up Bear Creek Road, every single place where they did intensive removing of trees, including redwood trees, like Pilger Road, for example, there is excessive erosion. And there are little signs up as you drive up, or when you did during the storms, that said, "Caution, mud, slippery," and you don't see those signs very often. And so, anecdotally, yes, there's a great deal more erosion. And personally, our dear neighbor trusted PG&E inspectors to allow them to take out 25 completely healthy Douglas fir trees from a stand of Douglas firs. And that was happened in October. And I warned him because he always had erosion problems on his own road. And he said, "That's okay." They assured me it's all going to be okay. So sure enough, 2 weeks ago in the big storm, a very large and previously healthy Douglas fir tree fell down because it lost its neighbors. And it was in the center of the stand and didn't have the same root system. So guess what it did? It came down took out the pole, the crossbeam, all the wires in one pole, and then the neighborhood pole lost. And this is just one person being served on his little private road. 25 trees taken back 30 feet from the wires. So this is why we don't feel that PG&E has been responsible, because they have not looked at the environmental issues at all.
Can stream groundwater disconnect be based on factors other than pumping, or are surface water, groundwater otherwise always connected?
Yes, there are a number of things other than pumping that can impact that. If you remember Georgina's presentation where she had showed the geology, we have layer upon layer of aquifer, and sometimes they're connected to each other, sometimes they're not, sometimes there's a hard pan, sometimes you'll end up with a hard pan, which is usually clay or something impervious, and that'll send water off to the side somewhere. So it isn't the graphic that I showed where we just have this beautiful, basically a straight line from the groundwater to the creek. We don't have that here. It would be a lot easier to manage if we did, but there are any number of factors that can, other than groundwater extraction, that can disconnect a surface water from the groundwater below it.
Well, I was just going to say, we have a situation like that on Bean Creek, the upper part of Bean Creek, which has gone dry. You look at the old records, and it's reported to have gone dry back into the 40s, really before the groundwater pumping really picked up. That's not to say it hasn't been made worse, that dry and reach of Bean Creek, but it's where the creek comes down, crosses the Zayante Fault, and basically hits that really highly permeable Santa Margarita sandstone. The water goes down and into the basin, and then it surfaces back in the stream bed several miles further downstream, where but because the really permeable sandstone, the water table can be almost level because the water just sort of seeks a natural level. We see the same thing in Valencia Creek and down in the Mid-County Basin, where the very permeable sands, the water just goes down well below the bottom of the creek. But pumping can make those situations worse. Groundwater pumping can make those situations last longer and more extensive.
Changing gears significantly, how did Santa Margarita get its name?
Typically geologic formations are named where they are first discovered, and I think that this comes because the Santa Margarita sandstone was first described down in the town of Santa Margarita, which is down in San Luis Obispo County. I don't know if there's any geologists here that could correct me on that, but that was my understanding. Whereas the Lompico Formation was first described here in Lompico, so we've got that.
There you go. This is actually similar to a couple of the questions that came up in earlier, so I'm going to consolidate them. Can you use percolating ponds? And some other people said spreading fields, and I think you actually saw that in some of your PMAs. Can you use percolating ponds or spreading fields to level the groundwater and stream water flow and sort of just recharge? Is that something that can be done here? What was that answer? Sort of?
Sort of. I mean, we have looked at that as an option around here. Particularly, it's been suggested that the sand quarries could provide very suitable terrain for that sort of thing. One of the problems with the sand quarries is that they have been the good sand's been taken out, and what's left is a lot of fine material and waste, and it's all been compacted, so their permeability is not as good as we would expect them to be. Getting out, and there's also a lot of unique biotic species associated with those quarries that really limit the amount of land disturbance. Spreading grounds take a lot of land disturbance, so if your real estate is expensive, then it's also expensive. We're actually looking more at using injection wells in this basin as methods of getting water back into the ground and not taking up so much real estate.
Would the city of Santa Cruz ever want to increase surface water storage resources, for example, raising the height of Loch Lomond Dam or building another reservoir or flood an old sand quarry?
The raising Loch Lomond Dam was looked at during the Water Supply Advisory Committee process, and for a variety of reasons that didn't appear to be very feasible. Adding another surface water storage is not really in the cards. Some of you who've been here way longer than I have will know that there was a conversation years ago to talk about a surface water reservoir on Zayante Creek. And in fact, the Felton diversion was sized to fill not only Loch Lomond, but also Zayante at the time that, assuming that it didn't get full with just whatever the natural recharge was from rainfall. The third part of that was?
No, the quarries.
I think, as John said, we are interested and have been talking about the quarries, particularly the Hanson Quarry, for a potential upper storage and recovery site, but not for surface storage.
Will all new Scotts Valley development projects be required to support a recharge system?
Yes, but that's not actually mandate from water supply perspective, but stormwater regs. State stormwater code at this time requires pretty much any new development to maintain or better make improvement to a pre-project level. And then why not for water supply? I mentioned earlier it's a very, very expensive source of water because it's so seasonal and peaky. So to size that system is 10 times more expensive than any other supplemental supply project we have looked into. The other reason is what many of the speakers talked about, that it's very specific to the site, that some areas start with a hard pan, or some areas it's 50 feet down is a hard pan, so putting something on top of it is only going to benefit that specific site and not the basin at large.
All right, we're at 1:30, so I'm going to just do one more question, and then we'll close things out. Chemicals like glyphosate are used throughout the watershed, sometimes legally, sometimes maybe not. Are chemicals, pesticides, herbicides, oil and gas detected in San Lorenzo Valley ground and surface waters?
I can tell you about
San Lorenzo Valley, so there. You want go ahead, and then I'll go to Rick. So no, yeah, both. Yeah, Rosemary started, and then go to Rick. So.
We did in 2016, and we've done some further work, but you can find on our website a work on looking at what's called constituents of emerging concern. And it was a series of tests. There were 6 over the whole year. There's 1 a quarter, and then there was a sort of a low flow and a high flow times. We did not detect any glyphosate, excuse me. We did detect atrazine, which is another sort of herbicide, and a number of pharmaceuticals and personal care products. Obviously, these are at, microgram, nanogram per liter kind of levels, so very low levels, but we did not detect Roundup at all.
For the San Lorenzo Valley Water District, we have sampled for glyphosate and have not found any detection levels. Our concern, besides glyphosate, is in our north system, our surface water, as we've determined through the County Ag Commission, that there is some pesticides used high in the watershed at Christmas Tree Farms. But we have not found any detection from any of the types of chemicals that they use, but we do monitor.
And I guess one other thing to say is we've monitored in Loch Lomond and have not seen it. We have historically used Roundup in the basically for invasive species control in the Loch Lomond watershed, that lands that we own, and we have monitored historically over a very long period of time for that. We haven't done any use of that particular pesticide or herbicide for more than a year.
So there's actually, from the last round, there was some that we couldn't get to, but from this just last round of several different discussions, there's only 3 cards left. Do you guys want to hang out? Let me go through three remaining questions. Folks feel like being troopers for 3 more questions? All right. I want to try to honor what came in. No, I don't care what they want. They'll stay. Is Santa Cruz looking at expanding recycled wastewater? And if so, what's being considered? And if not, what are the limiting factors?
Yes, we have been looking at a whole series of options, and advanced treated recycled water or non-potable water is on the table. We have a study that looked at, I think, 40 different options that was finished last summer. Currently, we're not thinking that that's in the near-term future, but if you believe the projections for climate change, then ultimately probably recycled water and or desal may ultimately be in the future, but it's probably a pretty long way out.
Will restoring the in-stream swimming hole dams be good for groundwater recharge and fish restoration if under control of Fish and Wildlife?
No.
And on that note,
we worked for a long time, and the San Lorenzo had something and has something like 33 on-stream dams. Most of them aren't in place anymore. Only one, I believe, actually went through the permitting process. I may be wrong on that, but that was at Mount Herman. There was a lot of issues that we had with people putting them up simply because they thought it was aesthetically pleasing. They didn't have adequate fish passage. They would pull the boards in, they would take them out at all times of the year. Oftentimes would have very large freshets that would result in scour. And you know, this river used to work really well. And before we had these in-stream dams, and if we had the habitat complexity that we were talking about, that the large trees that scour and create the deep pools, we might actually have something that's a close surrogate to these on-stream dams that used to be all over the river.
all right, well, I want to have another big round of applause for our panelists, please. Several of these folks drove a very long way to make sure they were here. Obviously, every one of these folks spent time putting their presentations together for you. So I'm going to actually just look to our leadership team and see if there's any closing comments that you want to send folks off with before we close out for the day.
I just want to say, for those of you who are here and gave us your Saturday, thank you so much. And for those of you who are like 2 for 2, you're like really champions. And I hope you take one of those stickers out there and put it on and you know, tell your neighbors that you're really into this. And we hope to see you back here next month. Come back.
Thank you all. Take care.